Okay, this is our last session of the day. We have been discussing this for a number of years at COAR about the need for a more accurate international repository directory. The current directories are, the information is quite out of date. Repository managers don't update their information often, regularly. They don't feel a strong connection to the international repository directories. So we have been discussing for several years how we can have a more community-based approach to an international directory. And thankfully, we have Paul, who is our technical consultant at COAR and also is with Antleaf, which is his own consulting company. But he has been very helpful in terms of helping us think what kind of model would be sustainable and also effective in terms of shared curation for repository records in a directory. And Paul has not been alone. We've been working on this with some of our partners from different regions, including Kazu Yamaji from the National Institute of Informatics, Lautaro from La Referencia, and several others from different regions. So we have vetted this model and discussed it quite in depth, and we think that this is going to be something that will work well. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Paul Walk to lead the discussion here around the International Repository Directory.
Good afternoon. I'm going to try to speak as slowly as I can to have pity on our brave translators over here. And we have plenty of time, so it should be okay. So, as Kathleen introduced, I'm going to talk about the International Repositories Directory project. So this is a COAR initiative. We've been developing these ideas. I'm basically going to repeat some of what Kathleen said because she hadn't looked at my slides, and so she just started to say these things. But I'm going to go into a lot more detail, and mainly I want to explain the distributed curation model, which we think is at the heart of the chance of this succeeding. So I'm going to speak for a little while, as slowly as I can. I'm going to keep reminding myself to speak slowly, and I'm going to ask you to do this if I speak too fast, okay? We do have time, so if you have questions which are about clarifying what I've said, then please put your hand up and we'll take questions during the presentation. If you have a more general question, then wait until the end and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I'm going to speak for a little while, and then my colleague Kazu will speak and give the perspective from Japan. And then my other colleague, Lautaro, will speak for a while and present the perspective from Latin America. Before we start, just a quick note about some of the terminology. So the word repository is very familiar to us, but it's not a particularly precisely defined term. So for the purposes of the IRD and for this discussion, we'll say that a repository is a system which provides open access to material which is relevant to scholarly research or teaching and learning. And the other term which is we use throughout this presentation is this idea of a network. And what we mean by that is a sort of logical group of repositories where the group is defined most often through geopolitical scope. So it might be that there's a national repository of, a national network of repositories, or possibly, we have several international networks also. And there's some examples there like La Referencia and NII in Japan. It's important to remember that some of these networks overlap as well. So particularly in Europe, for example, we have OpenAIR, but we have individual networks within countries in Europe who participate in OpenAIR. So the title is why do we need a directory of repositories, an international directory of repositories? So the first thing, which is kind of obvious really, but I think we're all aware that repositories are starting to become more important in the scholarly communications landscape to support open access. I think over the last 20 years there have been some ups and downs of importance of repositories, but we're definitely on an up at the moment. So, and I think that there's a requirement to gain an understanding of the repository landscape, a detailed understanding of what repositories are out there, the nature of those repositories, the sorts of content that they contain, some of the services which they may provide, some of the means of accessing the content, and so on. This is the most important point, I think, number 3 here. Repositories change, the systems change, the nature of the content in those systems changes, repositories migrate from one platform to another. I'm sure Peter, who was presenting earlier, would be able to give you all kinds of stories about repositories that have changed in all kinds of random ways. As I'll come on to in a little while, we've done a little bit of research into the extent to which available information is out of date, and it's depressingly out of date. So this is a really important point here, and it's really at the heart of what we need to solve. And then I think the other point to make is that there is a sort of functional requirement from infrastructure services, aggregation services, to have an authoritative list of repositories, ideally with some information about APIs, that kind of thing. And if we can maintain, if we can focus the effort on making sure that information is up to date in one place, that will be of great use to a number of different services. So the question that I'm asked most frequently when talking about this is why not use OpenDOAR? So there is a service called OpenDOAR, which many of you will have come across. It's a service run by JISC in the UK. It's been around for more than a decade, I think. Currently it lists about 6,000 records about repositories around the world. But what we have learnt, and we've been hearing this for some years actually, is that the data in OpenDOAR is not necessarily very reliable. One of the main complaints is that it's quite difficult to add a new repository to OpenDOAR. The process for doing this is not straightforward. I've done some evaluation of the data, and I found, for example, that 20% of the records in OpenDOAR didn't respond to any URL. So as far as I could tell, the repository had disappeared or changed so completely that the record was useless. And interestingly, 50% didn't have a working OAI PMH interface. Again, it's possible that the URL has changed, but that's a fairly depressing level of accuracy. The information about platforms is quite poor as well. There are platforms which I'm aware of, which are being used, which are just not registered in OpenDOAR at all. A small point perhaps, but an important one, the licensing of the data is unclear. It's basically not specified. And this means that really any effort to even try to use that data in a new system is quite problematic. So we're probably going to have to start from scratch. And then the final important point here is JISC, who own and operate OpenDOAR, have said that they are no longer committed to serving a sort of an international user base. They want to really focus OpenDOAR as a service for UK universities. JISC is, generally speaking, narrowing its focus to UK universities. So we think we need something which is more properly global in its its outlook and in its service. So the big lesson really from OpenDOAR is that trying to maintain a database of information about tens of thousands of repositories is just too expensive to do in a centralized way. If you've really just got a service with one or two people working for it, and they're mostly doing manual checking and updating of the data, they're never going to be able to do this very efficiently. It's always going to be out of date, and that's an expensive service to operate as well. So, and this is really where we start to get into the heart of what we're going to try to do differently with the IRD. But just before we do, I think it's important to say, well, what we need to solve is that we need to have a system where the data is easy and quick to add, easy and quick to update, automatically where possible, easy and quick to verify. And again, we will automate that to the extent that that's possible. And it needs to be trusted by the users. It's the most important thing. It's pointless if it's not trusted. So it needs to become an authoritative directory. I can't remember what title I gave this slide, but I think it was something like a better approach to doing this. This is the funniest presentation I've done in a long time. Okay, so the IRD will be centrally hosted and managed by COAR. Oh no, Carla, don't worry. That's very kind, thank you. Oh, bless Carla. It's actually funnier if I don't know what the title is, Carla. So the IRD will be a centrally hosted system, but what we are seeking to do is to have a model where the data is managed in a highly distributed way, because that's where the burden and the inefficiency lies. It's in the curation of the data. So we have this distributed model of responsibility. The idea is that each of the networks, remember we talked about the networks being a collection of repositories, probably national or international. Each network will have a designated responsible party. So the responsible party will be an organization usually, probably always an organization of some kind, that accepts responsibility for ensuring that the data about those repositories is up to date in the IRD. Now, this is about responsibility. It's not about actually updating the data necessarily. It's about taking the responsibility. The important thing here is that it gives the IRD service somewhere to go to say, the data about the repositories in this region or this particular group seems to be out of date, or probably it just needs to be checked because it hasn't been checked for a year or something like this. Please, can you arrange for that to happen somehow? And that's a fairly pointless diagram showing what I just said, but the idea is that each network has a responsible party responsible for a number of repositories. So the other concept in this model is the authorized user. So the authorized user is an actual user account on the IRD, which has the privilege, the ability to update a record about a particular repository, or possibly more than one. Now, sometimes this will be, so the authorized user is given that authorization by the responsible party. Now, in some cases, that will be somebody who works for the responsible party organization, just looking after 20 repository records. Some of the networks are much larger. So I'm hoping that NII in Japan will become the responsible party for the repositories in Japan, for example, and that's 630, I think, repositories. So in that case, and we would have to talk with NII about how they do this, but the idea is that they can give a number of user accounts the authority to maintain and update those repository records. So we're separating the responsibility from the actual task of doing this. Another important point is that the authorized user may actually be a machine, a piece of software. It doesn't have to be a person. It just has to be a means of updating that information. So here's a slightly less useless picture, I hope, which has an awful lot of lines on it. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that by using this concept of the responsible parties and the authorized users, we can accommodate quite a variety of ways of ensuring that the data is kept up to date. So in network one, we have a very simple arrangement where the responsible party gives that job to one of their own staff and says, please update these records. In network two, the responsible party decides that it trusts the repository managers, the people actually running the repositories, to update their own records. So it gives them that responsibility to do that. In network three, this is a sophisticated responsible party that's written some brilliant software which goes out and does all of this automatically. And nobody needs to put any sort of human effort into that. And any combination of these would be possible. So just a couple of points about the sort of basic functional design. So this will be a web service. We'll be making sure that it works for human users and remote software processes. In this worldview, software processes are first-class citizens. You know, they're as important as the human users. We'll be looking for ways to automate the curation wherever we can, and we're doing some experimentation and some prototyping with various tools for doing this. Again, I'm going to be talking to people like Peter, I know has done some work in this area. There are some good there's some good prior art which we can follow here. So a note about what a repository would have to be, what characteristics it would have to be included. I think we want to be as open as possible, but I've listed a couple of criteria there. I think the repository has to be open access to be listed in the IRD. It has to have a functioning homepage, a web page that you can go to. You'd think that would be obvious, but as I said, 20% of the ones in OpenDOAR don't even have that, or at least OpenDOAR doesn't know what it is. And we think it needs to have a functioning OAI PMH interface. All of the repository platforms that we're aware of have the capability of serving OAI PMH. There are lots of systems which are not repositories which have an OAI PMH interface, so there may be some occasional issues about, for example, some publishing platforms that support those protocols may want to be listed. I think we're going to have to come up with some kind of policy about this, but those are the functional requirements. And I don't think we need any more constraints than this. And then finally, the IRD itself, the software will be made open source under the MIT license, which is what's called a liberal open source license. And the data, I think we don't want to make what I think is a mistake in OpenDOAR, which is that the license is not clear. I think all of the metadata held in the IRD will be public domain, so C's Creative Commons 0. So a little word on progress. So far we've consulted with representatives from different networks. This was the group which Kathleen was talking about earlier. We're going to hear from Kazu and Lautaro in a minute. We've evaluated the quality of the OpenDOAR data just to get a sense of the scope of the problem that we're about to take on. if you're going to open repositories in Stellenbosch next month, I'll be giving a presentation about what I found when I evaluated that data. We've been looking at other data sources, so there are other directories of repositories. So there's Re3 data, which lists data repositories. I've looked at the COAR data from Peter. There's another very old directory called RAW, which I can't tell if it's really still live or not. It's difficult to say, but we're looking at any examples of this kind of thing to learn how best to do this. And as I said, we've been experimenting with the software which would need to be written to perform all these functions. So yeah, just an acknowledgement. So this is the group of representatives that we were working with, three of whom are here today. And I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to hand over to Kazu. And as I said, we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards.
So maybe can I press the Alt button? Not hiding this. Okay. All right. I'd like to introduce our idea about the Japanese perspective to this international directory. So anyway, as you may know, you did it. So now I can see my titles, so I don't have to worry about my memory anyway. So as you may know, so in Japan we have the repository network named the JP COAR, denoted on the left-hand side, bottom side. This is a kind of the community of the Japan, kind of the core community in Japan, and as a NII, we are cooperating the cloud service for the institutional repository named JP Gyro Cloud, and now almost more than 750, almost 800 institution has already been employed our service as their the repository system. And of course, since we have this Gyro Cloud service, we have the kind of the repository registration service as the institutional end users. And in addition to that, we also still has the repository operated by the on-premise manner, denoted by the yellow database. And we still has more than 100 the institutions still running their repository by using the DSpace or the other open source software by their own effort. But we are all together getting the information, aggregating the data from each individual repository to our aggregators named NII-RDB, which is also has the registration system. And it's in our case, it's much more easier to compare to the other situation to provide our repository information to the institutional repository directly. So in this, the situation we are talking about, what is our benefit to the international directory? So maybe we are talking about like this way. So on the left-hand side, I described the current, the usual model for the open infrastructure. For instance, this is OpenDOAR, and also this international the directory is also the kind of the open infrastructure. So in the usual the model, some organization will develop the service and operate the service, like the COAR and the archive and the Zenodo, and this is all about the open infrastructure. And in many occasions, some service, in order to their sustainable operation, try to launch the kind of the membership, the model. and getting the small amount of money from individual the user institution, and then try to build up some sustainable operation model. This is the current model. And in addition to that, maybe the recently the organization like SCOS or IOI has been studied, and then getting some certain amount of money to inject to the initial cost or some sustainable operation cost. But in our case, so these are happening all over the world. But it's, as a single institution, it's so hard to pay one individual service, one another, to get the approval from the institution is so hard, even in it's a small amount of money to pay the additional cost to the open infrastructure, so hard. So in comparison with the current the model, our new model, the international directory service, is something like that. I denoted on the right hand side. So compared with the current model, maybe as a Japan or as a one institution related to this international repository directly, we will pay as a workforce, as a curation cost on behalf of the central institution operated by this service. So, and this is also this is a kind of the membership fee, but we are not paying the actual money, but also but we are paying as a workforce for the curation on behalf of the central organization. So this is much more easier to pay each individual the service. So rather than that, maybe it's more easier to provide our workforce to the service, and this is also has a additional effort. As a the Far East country, as a Japan, it's the language difference, so it's so hard to involve in the community to operated by the operating this open infrastructure. But in case of the current model, trying to have it in the international repository directly, so we always have to be involved in this the service as a curator, or as one of the part of this functionality of this the directory service. So always as a JP core, as a NII, always we have to be pay attention to this service as a part of this service. So this is so important for us, to be the member of this service, and always to be aware, and always have to be careful about the quality of the data, and as a member of this the services. And of course, indirectly, virtually, as I mentioned on the very right-hand side, we are also paying the small amount of the money from our core membership fee to this, the core the operation. But this is the kind of the negligible the amount of the money. So if I compare with the current usual model of our each individual open infrastructure. So this is one of the benefit we are expecting to this, the new our international repository directory. And in addition to that, so the figures, the tables I wrote on the top side is the current data model of the usual OpenDOAR directory. So in addition to this conservative data model, so maybe we can add a additional value to this. It's automatically changed. And anyway, add the value and the information to the conservative usual data by using our the result from the additional core working group. So on the color, now it's okay. So as you may know, so we have an activity named COAR, the framework, this COAR community framework. So defined a I don't know. I have no idea. I never use that. But anyway, I try to push the the button again. Or it's better to how to. So, can I ask you again? So on the core community framework is the kind of, well, we are providing the assessment of, and then maybe it's automatically changed the page. So it's better to show there. Yeah, this is good enough, I guess. Otherwise, they automatically change to the next page. So the core original, the community framework is something like this. And as one of the activity of a Asia OA, the core Asia OA, it's so hard to interpret or evaluate each individual repository system. So we developed this kind of a checklist. So whether or not each individual repository in our region is satisfies this, the core community framework or not. So this is a kind of the checklist and easy to answer by the yes or no way. And based on this checklist, we also develop a kind of the survey system to show that this is a kind of the dashboard. So, and by using this, the checklist and the dashboard, so we can evaluate. This is a kind of the self assessment. However, we can show that this repository can be satisfied the kind of the core community framework evaluation or not. And by using the result from the survey, so we can add additional information on top of the conservative record of the international the repository directly. So, and maybe so publishers or the other service can utilize the additional service in addition to the conservative OAP image-based URL. So like this way, maybe I guess, on top of this, the international repository directly, we can merge the different kind of the activity which is happening around the core, and then merge the information into this record and provide the good quality service. So this is our intention, and I would like to contribute more from the Asian country to this, the core directory new service. So that's all.
Tengo que bajar esto ahora. Yes. Okay. Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Gracias a Paul y a todo el equipo por habernos invitado a dar nuestra visión y participar también en todo el proceso que fue la discusión de este directorio de repositorios. Como se han dado cuenta, estoy hablando en español. Solo que no me está dando... no, but it's okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Gracias. Bueno, entonces la idea es compartirles un poco cuál es nuestra visión desde la región de lo que ha ocurrido históricamente con el registro de repositorios primero que solíamos usar o solíamos usar parcialmente, que es OpenDOAR, y que históricamente tiene una pobre cobertura de nuestra región. En principio porque era percibido hace un tiempo como algo externo a la región y no fue del todo nunca aceptado como algo realmente global, al menos en algunos de nuestros países, y entonces había cierta reticencia en algunos países o en algunas instituciones en contribuir de forma activa ahí. Y también porque cuando lo hacían había como un serio, a veces, retraso en la respuesta, en el proceso en el que alguien daba de alta los datos o cargaba los datos y eso era respondido, era sumado al registro. Nosotros, como parte del trabajo con OpenAir y como OpenAir usa OpenDOAR activamente, habíamos impulsado y hemos impulsado la adopción de OpenDOAR en su momento, porque necesitamos interoperar y entonces tener alguna forma común de referirnos a nuestros propios repositorios, usando el OpenDOAR ID sobre todo como una forma de conectar y poder referirnos al mismo repositorio en los dos agregadores, ¿no? Entonces, lo que hemos visto es que, como consecuencia de esto que les contaba, ese registro OpenDOAR está muy desactualizado y inclusive se ha perdido la memoria en las instituciones de que alguna vez alguien dio de alta el repositorio en OpenDOAR. Entonces, algunas veces cuando le preguntamos al repositorio, ¿ustedes tienen una ID OpenDOAR porque lo requerimos para algún proceso? Algunos te dicen, no sabemos, y intentan registrarse de nuevo, o se buscan y se sorprenden y se encuentran, y dicen, pero esto está todo desactualizado porque, como decía Paul, el OIPMH cambió y demás. Y desde nuestro lado, no hubo tampoco incentivos en mantener esa información actualizada en muchos casos, porque justamente no había una razón lógica para hacerlo, porque de nuestro lado, nosotros en la referencia, como verán, no usamos esa puerta para entrar a ser cosechados, sino que nosotros nos fundamos en el trabajo que hacen nuestros nodos nacionales, seleccionando y curando la información de los repositorios de cada país, porque somos una red federada. Entonces, pero al mismo tiempo sería bueno poder responder preguntas cuando quieren preguntar en forma global y comparativa cómo es el estado de los repositorios en nuestra región. Es algo que sería muy importante tener un registro realmente global y con el apoyo de las comunidades para poder entonces estar bien representados en eso como región, en ese directorio, y cuando alguien pregunte cuáles son los repositorios de Latinoamérica, pueda encontrar una fuente fiable para alimentar otros sistemas, para calcular indicadores, para lo que sea que queramos hacer. Y bueno, y en el contexto de las leyes nacionales, de depósito y de las recomendaciones UNESCO, creemos que es muy importante poder contar con una forma validada y actualizada, una fuente actualizada de información para alimentar todos estos sistemas. Entonces, como les contaba, OpenDOAR no es usado básicamente en nuestra infraestructura, como una forma de entrada, como sí lo es, por ejemplo, en OpenAir, que alguien tiene que registrarse en OpenDOAR para estar ahí. No lo hicimos por todo esto que les conté, ¿no? De que no era un poco resistido en ese sentido. Y la información de los repositorios que son parte de la referencia, como les decía, son curados y mantenidos por cada uno de los nodos. Entonces nosotros ya tenemos esta estructura y esta idea de que nuestro sistema es federado, nuestro listado de repositorios es federado. Nosotros no cosechamos a los repositorios, sino que cosechamos nodos nacionales, y son los nodos nacionales que son los que tienen el conocimiento del ámbito local, del sistema nacional, son los que identifican y mantienen esas listas de repositorios. Entonces sabemos con certeza que eso, como decía Paul, es un repositorio de acceso abierto, que tiene un OIPMH funcionando. Entonces todas esas garantías de que realmente estemos encontrando un repositorio, porque también hemos encontrado cosas en algún momento graciosas cargadas como repositorio en OpenDOAR, y que no lo eran, digamos, quiero decir, necesariamente. Entonces, lo que sí es importante para nosotros, de momento, sí la identificación de un OpenDOAR, nosotros la utilizamos y la cargamos, y cuando está disponible la registramos en nuestros sistemas, e incluso en colaboración con OpenAir, nosotros hicimos una contribución y una sugerencia a que un ID de repositorios sea incluido en el provenance del registro por los agregadores. Entonces, de esa manera, porque si alguien cosecha un agregador, es interesante tener una forma de identificar de forma también única y persistente a el repositorio original que dio esos datos. Entonces, nosotros hoy estamos haciendo eso para los repositorios que tienen OpenDOAR pero si tuviéramos un repositorio un directorio más confiable, podemos sistematizar eso de una manera mucho más confiable y poder entonces mudar también a usar mucho más esa información si está validada por nuestros propios nodos, validada por nuestras propias instituciones, como una forma común de llamar a los repositorios, de apuntar y demás. Entonces, esto es un poco lo que estaba diciendo. Enfocarnos más en el conocimiento de los sistemas nacionales para poder mantener esta información. En ese sentido, el modelo propuesto por COAR nos parece muy, muy conveniente para ese modelo distribuido de curación y de partes responsables y de poder delegar. Es un modelo que nos parece muy, muy interesante para este concepto. Y esa idea de poder construir juntos como comunidad y con la curación y la participación de distintas redes, un directorio que sea percibido como realmente global, ¿no? Porque lo dijo Paul también, las noticias que tuvimos también de JISC fue que OpenDOAR se iba a enfocar más en el escenario nacional de UK y menos en el escenario global. Entonces, frente a todas estas noticias, necesitamos también que todo ese esfuerzo que se hace de mantenimiento y de curación por nuestros nodos, de poder tener una lista de realmente repositorios, realmente de open access y con todas las características, sea reflejado en ese directorio global. Por eso vamos a estar muy interesados en contribuir en esos procesos de curación con toda nuestra red. Bueno, esto básicamente es lo que quería contarles. Si hay preguntas o si hay, después podemos atenderlas con Paul, pero básicamente la idea, el espíritu de lo que quería transmitirles es que esta propuesta, este modelo y esta forma de trabajo encaja perfectamente con el espíritu y el modelo federado de la referencia. Es algo que es muy natural para nosotros pensar, trabajar un directorio de este modo, y tenemos la buena predisposición de nuestros nodos para hacerlo. Así que eso, nada más. Muchas gracias.